So welcome everyone to today's webinar on mental health in the wake of COVID-19. This webinar is sponsored by the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC, housed at Rutgers School of Health Professions in the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. My name is Katy Rivera and I'm the project coordinator of the center and will be facilitating the webinar today. The MHTTC is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health and other related workforces to deliver evidence-based and empirically supported practices to individuals with mental illnesses. Please visit the MHTTC Network website for additional information at mhttcnetwork.org. Next slide, please. If you're interested in staying up to date with the events and products the Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC is providing, please sign up to receive our email communications. You can sign up at the bit.ly link provided on the screen. Following the webinar, you will be asked to complete a brief survey. We value this feedback and use it to improve our activities and inform future activities. The surveys are also important because our continued funding is linked to the completion of these surveys. So we thank you in advance for your feedback. We also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website along with the PowerPoint slides in the next couple of days. Next slide, please. We encourage you to interact with our presenters during the webinar by using the chat feature. Please post any comments or questions that you have in the chat and I will collect your questions as we go and ask them of the presenter during the Q&A time towards the end of the presentation. During the webinar, our presenter may pose questions to you, so please use the chat feature to answer these questions. Next slide, please. This presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Use and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. All material appearing in this presentation, except that taken directly from copyrighted sources, is in the public domain and may be reproduced or copied without permission from SAMHSA or the authors. Citation of the source is appreciated. This presentation will be recorded and posted on our website. At the time of this presentation, Eleanor McCanns-Katz is serving as SAMHSA Assistant Secretary. The opinions expressed herein are the views of the presenters and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement of DHHS, SAMHSA, for the opinions described in this presentation is intended or should be inferred. Now let's begin our webinar. We have PJ Wenger with us today. PJ has 29 years of experience working in the field of mental health. She has spent considerable time in a variety of settings developing her counseling experience. These settings include psychiatric emergency, inpatient treatment with both adults and children, in-home counseling for mental health issues, residential treatment, schools, and private practice. In the school setting, PJ Wenger has worked at the elementary, middle school, and high school level. In addition to this experience, PJ has been a trauma responder at the local, state, and national level. She has responded to large events like 9/11 and Hurricane Sandy, as well as traumatic events that affect schools such as suicides, traumatic deaths of staff and students, and homicides. PJ is licensed by the New Jersey State Board of Family and Health Practitioners and is a certified member of the National Board of Certified Counselors. She has a master's in counseling and an EDS in marriage and family therapy. So I will turn this over to PJ. Welcome, PJ.
Thank you, Katy. Welcome, everyone. I'm starting our webinar with just giving us a flavor of the state of mental health right now. And right now, the conditions are ripe for what we call a perfect storm for mental health. We can see the high numbers that are indicated on this slide. Anxiety, every sort of mental health condition that we're looking at has increased with our quarantine. 78% increase in anxiety, 55% increase in stress. 66% of people report sleeping difficulties. 65% report loneliness. And we have a lot of that in our elderly population who already experience some loneliness. 65% report in depression, 53% increase for prescriptions for anxiety, 25% increase for prescriptions for antidepressants. We know that there's increased substance abuse and addiction. I believe as of April, the statistics were there's a 117% increase in the purchase of wine sales and 55% increase in the purchase of beer sales. And that again was in April, so we don't know what the statistics are at the current moment. All this information was gathered via a Kaiser poll from April, where also 56% of Americans reported at least one negative effect on their mental health as a result of COVID. And 65% of frontline healthcare workers and families had negative mental health effects related to COVID. So these statistics were done via an online poll, and this is mostly adults because, of course, there's a lot of confidentiality and parental consents involved if you're going to poll adolescents. So while these are statistics in adults, we know that children are experiencing the same or even more of these symptoms from some of our outreach centers and counseling centers, also from my personal experience and what youth are reporting to me of the youth in the schools that I interact with. So again, if we consider that this is the number of adults experiencing these things, and we know that there are many children in these homes with the adults experiencing these mental health concerns, that children are also experiencing a great many of these conditions. So we really need to distinguish, what is going on and what is helping. So right now, if we talk about our student experiences of COVID, we're talking about trauma. So our students could be in homes where there is traumatic events going on, domestic violence, abuse, neglect, maybe a parent who's using alcohol or drugs, maybe a parent who already has a pre-existing mental health condition that may be traumatic for a child. There certainly is also psychological trauma because of the things that have happened via the COVID, death. If they've experienced the death of a loved one or a relative, we know that our typical ways of addressing death and the rituals have been altered significantly. Initially, when COVID started, we really, I think, believed that adolescents would be fine because they're always on their phone and they're always texting, but we realized really quickly how much they really need the in-person connection with their friends, and so the isolation has affected that tremendously. There's a great deal of fear and anxiety, and for children who already had a pre-existing condition of anxiety, the anxiety and fear has exponentially gotten worse. There is definitely a perception of threat. Will I get the virus? Will I die from the virus? Will somebody I love die from the virus? There's uncertainty about the future. We all experienced that coming into the school year. I know that many of the schools that I work with were initially talking about hybrid programs. Some of them were talking about in-person programs. And then quickly, as we approached the start of school with some of the incidents that happened in other schools across the United States and in the colleges, we quickly went to a completely remote program for students, at least for the initial startup. And again, reduced activities. Children thrive during the summer on their activities, summer camps, Bible camps, sports programs, and a lot of the schools are not having that. And so children are feeling that loss of their activities and their involvement. Some of the other experiences that students are having are the stressors that their families are under. We saw the numbers that was on the first slide. There's a lot of stress that families are experiencing, both financially, certainly the economics, if there's been, loss of the job or loss of income or a decrease in income, if they're behind on bills, domestic violence. We are aware that in the United States, there's been a 35% increase in domestic violence calls to the police, as well as an increase in the intensity of that violence. And domestic violence shelters are overtaxed, which decreases the options for escape for some of those people who are living in a domestic violence situation. There's a lot, if a parent has a mental illness, Some of what we're seeing in our adults who suffer from a mental illness is people have stopped taking their medications or are taking their medications erratically because they're lacking a routine or a schedule. And depending on the severity of that mental illness, our students are experiencing that firsthand. There is economic hardship. So right now there are 21 million people out of work, and the unemployment rate has grown to 13.3% unemployment, which is the highest rate since the Great Depression. So as of April, 42% of adults report that they or their partner lost jobs, have taken pay cuts, or taken cuts in hours, or taken a cut in salaries. And so that this has really affected them to the point that as of April, 29% people were reporting falling behind in their bills. Now, we are 4 or 5 months past that, and I'm not seeing that that condition is improving a great deal, and that there are more jobs being laid off. I believe some national corporations just announced that they will be doing layoffs in the next couple months. So that number is going to get a little worse. And again, children feel that hardship. If there is abuse or neglect already in a home, typically schools are where students do receive help either voluntarily or not. When a teacher or a staff person recognizes that a child has a bruise or a mark on them, and they report them to Child Protective Services for, assistance. And right now that's not happening because we're not in touch with those students. And while typically we would not be in touch with them over the summer, that is not true in all cases because of their activities and their sports, but certainly we would have been in touch with them last year. And the school year ended in a little bit of a confusing manner for many schools, with some students being MIA and some students really not engaging. I know a lot of my teenagers did tell me and honestly said that they would turn on their Zooms or their Google Chats and go back to bed. So I know that that was happening as well. Certainly, some of our students are experiencing complicated or traumatic bereavement. I've had students who have experienced the death of a loved one due to COVID, and there was not a viewing. They were not able to have some of that closure, and it was traumatic for them. And our normal rituals of processing grief and having funerals and having gatherings were not possible. And so that has taken on a whole new life of its own. The racial inequities, our students are very sensitive to the topics that are being discussed and the climate that is across the United States with some of the latest incidences. And so if in fact students are among some of those racial ethnic groups, they are experiencing some of that, what we call racial trauma. So this is what they're experiencing right now, and it's really difficult for them to process some of these things without the help of staff and educators in schools, who are usually the primary people during this time that children vent to. So we really want to talk about, because we really need to assess where our students are when they're returning to school. And we're going to talk a little bit about trauma, mental health, and stress, and how those three things look, and assessing our students and how we can do that. But trauma is really events and circumstances that may include an actual or an extreme threat of physical or psychological harm. Certainly natural disasters are one of those, violence, but certainly the COVID virus has, created a different kind of trauma that young people are experiencing, even older people are experiencing. And the individual's experience of these events or circumstances helps to determine whether it is traumatic. So if a student is in a home where there has been a death of a person by COVID, or somebody died, abruptly in the home, that may be traumatic for one individual and yet not for another. Oftentimes we have two children who live in the same home, and it may be an abusive home, and one child may be traumatized by the events that are occurring in the home, and another child may not appear to be affected at all. We have this same phenomena when our veterans return from the war. They have both witnessed very traumatic events, but one of them may develop a PTSD and the other may not. So again, it's very individual. It's how the individual assigns meaning to the trauma and how it disrupts them physically and psychologically as to whether it's experienced as traumatic. And once again, the long-lasting effects of the event are critical components of trauma. So these adverse effects may occur immediately or may have delayed onset. And oftentimes people who do experience a traumatic event in some situations may not even recognize the connection between the traumatic event and the effects they're experiencing. So for instance, when I'm doing some work in my urban school districts and I'm talking to children and teenagers and they're talking about community violence and how they often hear gunshots or their friends have been shot or somebody's been, knifed. These are common occurrences and they talk about them like they're common occurrences and they don't realize how traumatizing that is to their functioning. So there are 3 types of trauma that we want to identify. The first is acute, which is a single traumatic event or a sudden loss. It could be a physical assault or a sexual assault, that occurs one time, and that we call an acute trauma. There can be chronic trauma, which is multiple and varied events that occur, which could be like domestic violence or a serious car accident where there's repeated surgeries, or again, community violence. Somebody's been a victim of community violence. And then there's complex trauma, which is multiple interpersonal traumatic events from a very young age. So this is where we find, emotional trauma, emotional abuse, physical abuse, or constant neglect. And we're going to look at how that really changes a child. So the ways that trauma affects us are listed here. Biologically, emotionally, behaviorally, cognitively, physically, interpersonally, and then changes in our perception of the world. And we're going to dive into each of these a little bit more so that we have a better idea of what we're looking at. So when we look at biological trauma symptoms, we're looking at brain changes. And the physical structure of the brain is dynamic. It's why when someone gets a concussion, they may respond one way and another person might respond another way, because our brains are very different and they're very dynamic, so they change all the time. But what we do know is that brain structure interacts with brain functioning. So for instance, children who come from trauma or abuse or severe neglect tend to have structural changes in their brain. And what we see here in this picture is a picture of 2 3-year-old brains. The one on the left is a brain of a typically normal child with no trauma. You can see that brain. And the one on the right is a 3-year-old child who suffered extreme neglect and sensory deprivation for the first 3 years of their life. And this work is done by Dr. Perry. He does a lot of work and shows a lot of brain scans, and you can actually see the differences. But what we see is that the brain on the right is actually smaller. This is not Photoshop. This is not cropped for effect. This is the actual picture, and we see how small the brain on the right is, and we also see the large holes that are in the brain. And a smaller brain size equates to a lower IQ. There's also, the brain there's smaller corpus callosum, which is the part of the brain that connects the right and left hemisphere. So imagine that area is tinier and there's difficulty connecting those 2 brains or interacting back and forth. There's some physiological changes. So we have observed from the research that a child who has been physically abused, over time, their brain will actually resemble that of a brain that we typically see in an Alzheimer's person, a person with Alzheimer's disease. And this results in developmental delays and memory problems. So if we consider a person who has Alzheimer's and we look at some of the symptoms, they have trouble organizing, they have trouble remembering from one thing to the next, they have trouble retaining information, they sometimes are confused. if we look at that and then we consider what a child who is a victim of physical abuse incurs on a daily basis, those brains are the same. And so again, a child cannot do some of the things that sometimes we are asking them to do in an educational setting. There's also changes physiologically. So we have an increase in resting pulse rates. Traumatized individuals have higher blood pressures. There's greater physical tensions. All of these things make up the biological trauma symptoms that we're looking at. And then there's emotional effects of trauma. And, fear, we often say, oh yeah, they're afraid of things, but fear goes deeper than just I'm afraid of something. It's really frightening, intrusive memories that occur all day long. And we're going to hear later on from a survivor of trauma, actually what that experience is from somebody who's living inside that traumatized body. So they may have intrusive memories during the day, and they may have nightmares at night. And what they will experience is the same reactions when they're exposed to reminders of those traumatic events. So for instance, if a child was in a car accident and it was very traumatic, and months later they're driving down the same street around the location of that car accident, they will in their body begin to experience those same symptoms that they experienced at the time of that event. And again, we call those triggers, and sometimes children are triggered by their environment and by what's happening in a classroom. Certainly depression may arise, depression and sadness, which arises from a child's response to an abrupt loss of trust in other people. If they are abused or neglected, then what they learn is that adults are not trustworthy, and they may feel out of place, and depression and sadness may cause these children to have some suicidal symptoms, to have some suicidal thoughts, to think about that. And it's about ending the pain. It's about ending the, I don't know how to describe what's happening to me. Certainly there is anger, and we see this in a lot of victims who have experienced a traumatic event. And for children and adolescents, it really takes the form of non-compliance, rages, sometimes tantrums, being physically aggressive with their peers, or sometimes they break property because they're so angry. We're going to talk about how to handle those things a little later on in the presentation. They certainly have difficulty regulating their emotions. And so, they don't know how to cope with the feelings. They don't know how to cope with the anger, or the frustration, or that fear that comes up. And we're going to, again, see how that looks from the perspective of a child who has been a victim of a traumatic event. Certainly anxiety is prevalent among people who have experienced a traumatic event, because they are worried about whether those things are going to happen again, and they're worried about how that affects them, and they're worried about, will I be okay, and will people like me? There's all kinds of worries that go on in their head. And then all of these things sort of create a very negative self-image. Children may think that the event was their fault, if they had done something different. And oftentimes when I'm working with children who have been physically or sexually abused, they will often say things like, if I had done my homework, Dad would not have gotten mad, and then he wouldn't have hit my mom. They really take it on as something that is their fault, and if they could do something different. And so it makes them develop a very negative self-image. Then we have behavioral trauma symptoms. And again, sometimes when I'm doing this presentation, people will say to me, oh, well, do we just let children off the hook because we think they've been traumatized and it's better? And, I say it's not about letting them off the hook. It's about understanding what children have been through and having a different approach, and maybe having different consequences and approaching those consequences differently. But it's not to lower our expectations for children who've been traumatized. It's about lifting them up. So some of the behavioral things that we see in the classroom is avoidance. And avoidance is not just of work. Like, we often think children are avoiding work. Avoidance is of thoughts, it's of people, it's of places, it's situations that trigger recollections of their traumatic experience. So for instance, if I'm asking kindergarten kids to get in a circle, and hold hands. That may be a trigger for some children because touch has led to a negative experience. So they may not be able to do that, and they may act out, and we may kind of be punishing them without really understanding what's underneath that. So, again, for teenagers, avoidance is a very big thing that teenagers do, typically as a developmental thing. But what I tell people is that children avoid for two reasons. They act out for two reasons. They're either trying to get something or trying to avoid something. And we're going to talk about how some things don't work for all children. But one example is, there was a child who was molested in a shower at school. And then what happened is he stopped going to gym class because he didn't want to go to gym class because he didn't want to shower. And then eventually he stopped showering at home because when he got in the shower, it reminded him of the experience that he had in the shower at school. And so he stopped showering altogether. Meanwhile, his parents were fighting with him about showering and your hygiene and you smell and all of these things, when that was not what was at the root of the problem. And again, difficult for a child to talk about it. Self-injury. Children do cutting, they do self-injury behaviors to relieve pain. There are some children who do it for attention because they want people to see, they want help. There are other children who just do it because the pain inside of them is so great and so unbearable and they can't describe it to anybody, that they just want to feel better. So, again, that's where we get self-injury behaviors. Traumatic bonding. This is the Stockholm effect. Oftentimes, and I don't know how many educators have experienced this, but you see a mark on a child, you are a mandatory reporter, you call Child Protective Services, there's an investigation, and the child is adamantly defending the adult person in their home who is physically assaulting them. And we just sometimes don't understand it. That is the Stockholm syndrome. I'm defending the abuser because that's the only bond that I know. And again, it's, the bonds are certainly a distortion of a healthy bond by the child, but they will defend that abusive parent. Avoiding healthy age-appropriate peers. And the reason sometimes we see children who, we're easy to identify the child who plays with younger kids or is always hanging around the younger kids, and we might think that's a little strange or creepy even. But what they're doing is, little kids don't ask questions. They don't want to know information. They take you at face value, and as long as you're playing with them and they're having fun, it's easy. So a teenager who may be experiencing some of these things may find it easier to interact with younger children because there is no demands on their person. They don't have to tell any stories. They don't have to pretend that their life is not what it is. And so it's easier. We also have children who come from trauma backgrounds who overfunction and become parentified. And these are the children in school that look really well. They're always trying to help us. They're trying to help other people. They're really well behaved. But in fact, they are overcompensating for something that's going on under the surface. And so, I always tell people, those children who overfunction and those the ones that disappear are the ones that, we need to be looking at a little more carefully. Some, behavior tantrums and rages. And that is not to say that every child who throws a tantrum has been traumatized. Certainly children who are on the spectrum will sometimes need to have a tantrum to reset their emotional functioning. And again, just because they can't handle a change or something happened unexpectedly and they're having a response to that, it doesn't necessarily mean they're, operating from a trauma symptom. But again, we want to look at things and we want to have conversations with children. Then there are some cognitive trauma symptoms, and cognitive is really how children think. And so the first one, inaccurate cognitions, those are some of the things where I talked about children blaming themselves. He sexually abused me because I wore a dress. I didn't do my homework, so my father got mad and hit my mother. These are certainly, we hear kids say that and we say, I'm sorry, I mixed those up. That's the irrational cognition. I apologize. But we hear children say that and we think, how can they believe that? But it really is their belief system, and then some of the inaccurate cognitions follow because if like a child is abused by a primary caregiver, what they learn is that they can't trust their parent, or they can't trust the adult because they never know what they're going to get. If they live in a household with substance abuse, if dad is drunk, is he a happy drunk or is he a sad drunk? Is he an angry drunk? You know, if mom is a drinker, is she a neglectful drinker, or does she become angry? And then what are they getting when they get home? So because they can't trust those primary caregivers, they then transfer that belief to everyone in the world. If I can't trust my mom, no one is trustworthy. And that's where it becomes really inaccurate in terms of their thinking. Loss of faith is something that children from trauma often have as an experience, and we're going to again hear from a person about that. They lose faith in God. If their family is religious and they, you know, are part of a religious community, children may lose faith that there is a God, that God can help them, that God is loving. It's really a difficult struggle for them, you know, going to church every Sunday and kind of hearing these things about God and then experiencing this stuff in their lives. But they also lose faith in future. They lose faith in the future for themselves. You know, for instance, you know, there was a child that we were working with whose brother died in a violent crime in the neighborhood where there was a lot of community violence. And that was so traumatizing to him that he began to lose faith that he would ever make it to adulthood. And he really just started saying, you know, I'm never going to make it. My brother died. I'm going to die. I'm never going to reach 21. I might as well do whatever I want. And so he started taking all these high risks, you know, speeding in cars and, you know, going on robbery missions and things that certainly were not healthy for him. But because he saw no future for himself, he really decided, you know, what the heck, I'll just do whatever I want. You know, so again, it's that loss of faith. Unhealthy relationships, we're going to talk about certainly in length. But if I can't trust the world around me, and if I feel so badly about myself, it's really hard to have a healthy relationship. So, you know, that leads us into the interpersonal trauma symptoms. And children who experience trauma will withdraw from their peers because, again, they don't want to explain what happens in their house. They don't want to explain how their household is functional or not functional. They don't want other peers to know. There's a level of shame around it. There's a level of embarrassment around it. And as children get older and get into the teenage years and really begin to understand that not all their friends live like they do, that withdrawal can be even deeper because keeping the secret of what's happening in their lives is so critical for their functioning. And again, they begin to not enjoy activities because all of these things are swarming around in their head. You know, maybe the intrusive thoughts and maybe the low self-esteem and maybe that, you know, the world is scary and nobody can care for me. So it's difficult for them to enjoy anything. Again, difficulty establishing relationships. One of the primary core elements of a healthy relationship is trust. And, you know, we all know that if you know anybody who's been married and there's been an infidelity, it's really hard to repair a marriage when there's been an infidelity because we don't trust the partner anymore. And so again, if they believe that nobody is trustworthy, how can they really have healthy relationships? If they're afraid to be vulnerable, how can they have healthy relationships? And then sometimes what they begin to do is affiliate with high-risk peers because maybe I begin to run with children in a gang, or maybe I begin to run with people who are using drugs because they don't ask a lot of questions and they don't demand a lot of my authentic self. So again, that happens because there's a level of, it doesn't matter, I have no future, and these people are safe because they won't demand anything of me and I won't have to reveal anything. Changes in perception of the world as a result of trauma are, for me, the most significant side effects or symptoms of trauma. And these are the ones that I find that are very critical and the place where we as providers and educators can really change the world for a child. And so some of the changes that occur is that children really do not believe that they belong. They don't feel like other children. They don't look like other children to them. They don't have the same experiences as other children have. And so they begin to feel like they don't belong. There's nowhere for them to fit in.
And so sometimes they may ostracize themselves. The child who's always putting themselves outside of the group, that's a child who feels that they don't belong, that they're not going to fit in. They lose hope. And sometimes when I'm working with young clinicians or I'm working with educators, I tell them, we really need to be the beacon of hope for some of these kids. We are the only beacon of hope sometimes. And if we lose hope for them, then we are really just creating for them a very negative situation. And so we have to be the beacons of hope. Children who come from a trauma lens really look at the world as good and bad and look at themselves as good and bad. So mostly they look at bad. Again, they blame themselves. They're not like other kids. They're a bad kid because these things happen to them, or they're a bad kid because they don't have what other kids have. So they really begin to look at the world in very concrete terms of good and bad. And mostly it's the bad part. Opportunity. They do not see opportunity for themselves. So when we are saying, oh, there's so much, you can take advantage of, and you can go to college, or you can, go to trade school, or you can go into the service, or you can do this, or you can do that. We're really, that whole conversation is falling on deaf ears if a child really doesn't feel that there's any future opportunity for them. And again, children from trauma look at the world that it's a scary place. The world is scary, it's uncertain, it's unpredictable. I never know what's going to happen, so I have to be on high alert at all times to protect myself and defend myself. And that might sound very funny coming from, thinking about that coming from a child, but it's really how they view the world, and we're going to look at that. And then the last thing that I find is so detrimental for children is that they really feel that nobody can help them. So even though we're extending our hands and we're offering help, they really don't feel that you can help them, and so they don't reach back. And I often say to educators, the children that are the most difficult and the children that are the hardest and annoy us the most or push our buttons are the children who really need us the most. So if we can get over ourselves, I'll say it that way, if we can get over ourselves, we can really be that beacon of hope and that helpline that they need, and we can reach out and they will actually reach back. So I just want to read a trauma survivor's account, and this is a child who experienced a great deal of trauma and her experience of being in school. So I remember crying in the night. I found it difficult to hear Mrs. Patterson when she spoke in the classroom. I felt as if she were speaking from beneath tumbling waters or from the end of a long tunnel. She assumed I was daydreaming. I stopped imagining that I might one day be a teacher. No longer did my imagination dance me through the leaves. The sound of ringing church bells irritated me. Mostly, I felt ashamed and different. So we can see in this, and this is a real trauma survivor's account, this is not made up. We can see in this account how she begins to view the world as her not being a part of it, and how her teacher is far away in her mind, and that she stopped being hopeful and stopped thinking there was any opportunity for her, and just stopped enjoying the regular things, and about how that shame was such a big part of her. So the 3 E's of trauma, and we call these the 3 E's of trauma because this is what really determines how we view a traumatic event. So it's the event, it's the experience of the event, and it's the effects of the event on us, and how we attach meaning to that event. So, for instance, there was a situation where there was a convenience store robbery, and the perpetrator came in and held up the cashier at gunpoint, and there were 2 men in the convenience store at the time of the robbery, and the perpetrator held the cashier up, took the money, and then hit the cashier over the head with the gun and knocked him out. Police were called to the scene. And when the police arrived, they were trying to get statements from the 2 men that were in the convenience store. The first man was on his phone, FaceTiming his friends, telling them, you wouldn't believe what happened. I was at the convenience store and there was a robbery and everybody's fine, but the police are here and I have to give a statement and this is really wild. And he's going on and on with his friends on FaceTime. The other person who was in the store was crouched in a corner in the fetal position and was unable to give the police any account of anything that has happened. Again, same event, but the experience of the event was so drastically different. The person who was cowered on the floor was a person who had been a victim of trauma. And that incident triggered all of his trauma again so that he was functioning. And so again, could not even speak, could not give a description of the man who came in, could not talk to the police, did not have words. And that is the effect of his previous trauma on him that will kind of resurge any trauma that we have in the past. So again, the important parts of any traumatic event is the event, the experience, and how it affects us. And we learned this a lot in the aftermath of 9/11, because there were people who immediately went to therapy, who had great support systems, who were connected to people, who, despite the fact that they were in a very traumatic event, did not come out of it as scathed as some of the people who were involved in 9/11, went home, bunkered down in their houses, did not come out, did not do any kind of therapy. Some of them moved away. We saw a big exodus out of New York. And then years later, it comes back to haunt them. I actually have a great story. I went to California on a conference, and I got into the car that was taking me from the airport to the hotel. And the gentleman and us were talking, and he said, "Oh yeah, I used to live in New York. I moved out after 9/11. And we're like, "Oh, really?" And he started telling us about his experience after 9/11, and about how he couldn't work and he couldn't sleep and he was having nightmares. And he said, "I moved to California because I thought that was far enough for me to get away from all of it." And he said, and it followed me. So again, trauma can have a lasting effect if we don't address it. So what we want to do in schools is we want to really use a trauma sensitive approach. And, when I say that, people say, "What is that?" Well, it's a number of things, but it's the 4 R's that we talk about. So realizing how impactful trauma can be, the widespread impact of trauma, and really understanding those potential paths for recovery. There is recovery for trauma, and we need to recognize that. So just because, a vet comes back from war does not mean that they are always going to respond from a traumatic place. Just because a child is sexually abused, there is recovery so that they don't always operate from that place of being the victim. We need to be able to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in not only our students, but our families, our staff, and other people involved in the system. So sometimes when I'm at a school and a traumatic event happens, we are so focused on the students that sometimes we forget our fellow coworkers or some of the families. Just in daily life, if I'm asking a family to come in or parents to come into school to have a meeting about their child, because maybe that parent had a really negative experience in school when they were a child, they're really afraid to come into the school and they avoid it at all costs. It's not that they don't care about their child, it's that the school is a trigger for them about a traumatic experience that they had. So we really need to understand that and begin to work around some of those things. Responding with all of this knowledge that we have about trauma and incorporating it into our policies, our procedures, our practices, and really, focusing actively to not re-traumatize these children who have already been traumatized. So the status of our students, we really need to be, when we reconnect with them, is we need to begin with assessing what their mental health is, asking, the questions, opening up the conversation. Some of our students we may know already have an existing mental health condition. Some of them we may not. Some of them may have developed it while they've been away from us. So we really need to assess mental health. And what were they doing during the lockdown situation? Were they with friends and family? Were they not with friends and family? This has been a real struggle for the teenagers because at the start of the pandemic, when we were in a very strict quarantine, they were really locked down. And then there were some parents after a period of time who sort of lifted the rules and allowed their children and teens to gather in parks or, in playgrounds, whereas other teens would not be able to go out of their house because their parents were maybe more conservative. And so they could only look at the Facebook shots and the Instagram shots and the Snapchat shots of their friends all being together, but they weren't part of that. So there was a real imbalance among the teenagers about who was able to do things and who was not, and how that affected other people. Um, health of family and friends. Did any of our students encounter a person who had COVID? Did any of their family members catch the virus? Did any of their family members die? Did any of their friends catch the virus or die? What was the status of the health in the family? Or do they have a high-risk person in the home? A lot of times, there's been situations where people have taken in elderly relatives because they needed to care for them, but they were busy doing other things in their home, so they became part of the household. How was that? What are their coping strategies? Ask children, what are you using to cope with all of these things that are going on? What we do know from students that, I am talking to, and they're reporting back to me that vaping is really increased, and that their use of marijuana has increased because it helps them to calm down, or it helps them to be less anxious. And, again, I always kind of giggle because I'm wondering if they're all quarantined in their house, how they're getting it, but they seem to be able to get it. So, what are their coping strategies, and do they have any? Oftentimes when parents bring children to therapy with me, and this is pre-COVID, I would assess their children, and the number one finding that I had with most of my children and teenagers was that they had no coping skills. They did not know how to cope with feelings of anger or depression. And again, if I have an adult in my home who models something that's unhealthy, I'm going to follow those. I'm going to model that same behavior. So we need to find out what their coping strategies are. We need to find out what their routine and schedule was. I know a lot of my teenagers are up all night and sleeping all day. And I am constantly trying to tell parents, you need to get them out of bed. You need to have them be on a regular schedule, because when we reverse our sleep cycles, it does affect our mental health, and certainly does not keep them on any kind of a routine or schedule. Did they have to do chores? Did they have to do, I have one of my teenagers, the parent contacted me and said, she's diagnosed with anxiety, and the mom said, I am afraid that she's never going to leave the house now because she's getting so comfortable in a room. She doesn't even want to go for a drive with me or go to the store with me. And so we devised a plan where the teenager's job was to start to walk the dog twice a day. And she had to walk the dog so many blocks before she could bring it home. And that just got her out of the house, because she was becoming so afraid to leave the house. And from there, we added on other things that we needed her to do, so that, again, out of the house safely, but out of her room. And grief. Our teenagers are grieving not only people, but they're also grieving events. So ritualistic events that occurred for a lot of teenagers, they are grieving the loss of. So for our children who were in 9th grade last year, they're really grieving that they lost 9th grade year, that whole year of getting used to high school and figuring out what clubs I wanted to be in, or trying out for a sport, or being on a sports team for the first time. They've lost all that. And now they're coming back, and school is very different for them. Our seniors last year lost a lot of things, proms and plays and talent shows and things like that. And our juniors, who are now seniors, watch that. And now what they're doing is they're really expecting to lose a lot of those things again. And they're already becoming sad about those things. So again, we're going to talk about some creative ways to address that as well. And then academic, we need to understand the status of our students in terms of academics. So last year, not everybody was prepared to go remote. There were struggles with technology. There were struggles with kids who needed help, asking for help and getting answers, and struggling with, sometimes some of the assignments or routines. And where that might not be so prevalent in maybe like an ELA class or a social studies class, it certainly is prevalent in some of the maths and sciences. So we really need to understand where children are at. And then, what gaps they have, what they missed. And then we also need to be aware that there's going to be some recuperation that they're not going to be able to do, that we're going to need to be able to help them to be able to recoup and, move forward. So students vulnerability status. This is something we look at to see how vulnerable students are to some of the things that are happening around them. And it's based on internal factors as well as external factors. So internally, we already talked about our children's coping style. What do they use? Certainly, if there was a pre-existing mental health condition, we know that some of those are exacerbated right now by the events of the COVID and the climate we're experiencing across the nation. Emotional regulation. They're at home 24/7. So again, when we're at home, we have a whole lot more emotions than we do when we're in school, because we're still trying to present a certain persona and a facade and have people think that we're okay. But maybe at home, because we already have some trouble regulating our emotions, now we're just not regulating on a regular basis, and so it's hard for us to regroup. And then again, it is teaching children emotional regulation. If they're in a house where the adults are not emotionally regulated, they learn to be dysregulated. And so we again have to regroup and maybe teach them some strategies. If there is a history of trauma, we may or may not know that as educators. I know that, sometimes that's a little frustrating that we don't have information about our children, but sometimes the children will give you that information themselves. What is the self-efficacy level of our students? Do they have skills and abilities and things that they do well and strengths that they can fall back on? So we need to assess for those. Do we feel powerless? And children often feel powerless because they don't have a whole lot of decision-making power. But in this situation, that has increased, not only for the children, but also for the adults, because the adults are feeling powerless against what's going on in the world a lot of times. Children will, I call it vamping off the adults. They'll vamp off of that and feel even more powerless. And then again, what is their self-esteem level? It's very different for a child functioning who thinks that they can't do anything and that they're worthless and that it doesn't matter, from a child who has a really well-balanced self-esteem. So these are the internal factors that will create vulnerability for students. And then there's the external factors. We already talked about some of these. Who do they live with? In some of the quarantine situations, somebody may have been removed from the house. Either there was an elderly parent who was living with the children all the time and they went to live somewhere else because there were too many kids and too much exposure, or vice versa. Maybe I lost one of my parents who had to go live with a relative to take care of them. Maybe I have friends living with me. What is the parenting exposure? Are my parents punitive parents? Are they yelling all the time? Do they problem solve? Have they been able to handle this? Are they stressed out? What is the parenting style and what am I exposed to? Do I have dysfunctional family? Teenagers will tell you all about their dysfunctional family if you get them talking, because mental health is now becoming more of a topic that we talk about. Teens will often diagnose their family members or talk about their problems. What I find that teens do not want to talk about is substance abuse with their family members. So sometimes that might be a little harder. But, do we know if they have dysfunctional family? And what is their economic status? We already, showed you those stats with, 42% of adults, reporting that they've had some kind of job loss or pay decrease or furloughs. So has that affected the family? I had a child who would not ask her mother for pens and paper and back to school supplies because she was listening to her parents talk about how they couldn't pay bills and how they didn't know how they were going to pay the rent. And so she didn't ask for those things. And so we need to really ask our children those things because there are resources out there. There's a lot of banks who do backpacks for kids and collect supplies for children who don't have that. What is the social support? Have the kids had social supports? Have they kept in contact with their friends? I just talked to a teen the other night who his little quote was, "Everything is rinse and repeat. I just get up and do the same thing every day, and I'm so bored, and I'm so tired I'm over COVID." And, it was because his family was being very conservative about allowing him to interact with his friends. And so he talks to them, but he really hasn't seen them. So we devised a plan where his parents would drive up to the friend's house and stay in the car and let them talk across the sidewalk. just to see their friends. So again, what was their support? And again, adult models. Who was in the home and what were they modeling? And coping strategies of the adults. If an adult is drinking and that's their coping strategy and that's what a child sees, that's really difficult because it doesn't teach them a coping strategy. I like the story about the little girl whose mom was attending happy hours every Friday night. And the girl finally said to her mom, "Mommy, I don't know why you go to happy hours because it doesn't make you happy." And the mom realized that she had really been drinking more than normal and that the child was right. Going to happy hours did not help her to be more healthy. So when we get back to school, and again, this is remote or in person, but right now, since everybody's remote, it's really opening the conversation for the adolescents. And adolescents will talk if you talk to them and allow them the availability to have conversation. Asking them, what does COVID mean to them? And I have, people who say to me, well, kids say they're over it. And I say, okay, so let's explore that. What is it you're over? Are you over being at home? Are you over remote school? Are you over wearing masks? What is it that you're over? So really, pulling them out. Again, we have to be a detective a little bit because we really have to see where they're at. And what meaning does the virus have for them? I have teenagers who are talking about the world is changing and the world is never going to be the same. And I may never get to go to college because colleges aren't in person and it's just like being at home and having school. I have seniors who graduated whose colleges did not open and they're doing school remotely and they don't feel like college is any different than high school was. And that's really sad for them to have that perspective, but we need to understand where they're coming from. And what effect did it have on the students individually and collectively? Like, did it have effects on some of their relationships? I have teenagers who saying, I had a friend and we were really close and we don't talk so much anymore because we can't see each other. So again, a loss on top of a loss. And when school starts, talking to them. How did you feel about how the school year ended last year? What do you feel you need help with? As we start this school year, how did it feel to be away from school? What were some of the things that you enjoyed when you were away from school? What are some of the things that felt scary? And if anybody needs a list of questions to open this conversation, just email me. I will send them to you. What was the best thing you did while you were away? What was the hardest thing during your time away? Ask them about who was home. How was it to be around your brothers and sisters all the time? And they may say, oh, my sister went to stay with my grandmother all summer and they weren't here. So, then again, we know what this family situation is. How do they feel about returning? When we come back to school in person, if and when that happens, we're going to have to talk to students about, do you feel safe coming back to school? And how can we make you feel safe? And what would be specific things that we can do to make our classroom as safe for everyone? And what do you need? And what are some of the pros and cons about returning to school? Teenagers are already having this conversation about what would be good about going back to school and what would not. So they're already talking with each other about it. We're just now wanting them to talk to us. So you can take this and kind of store it away for the point in time when we do come back into person, because I am aware that we are really trying to push to get children back into in-person schooling. So we need to understand also with our students, is it stress, trauma, or mental health? And so we're going to look at a couple of these things. And stress is really a mental or emotional strain, and it does result from an adverse circumstance. And again, COVID is certainly an adverse circumstance. And it can be episodic, which, sometimes when we take on too much and then we become overwhelmed and we're not able to do things. So sometimes that's happening at home with parents who are now having to be teachers and work at their job and work at home and still cook meals and do all those things. Or it can be chronic, which is prolonged over time. And certainly COVID has created some chronic stress things that we're addressing and dealing with. And chronic stress can be degenerative. It can be harmful to our bodies and ourselves. So this is what stress in young children with, and I know that I'm kind of dealing with middle school and high school, so I'm just going to go through this quickly. But these are the experiences of a young child who is stressed out. Trouble concentrating, their behavior changes, they have a lot of fears, they develop nervous habits like nail biting or hair pulling or scratching. They tend to withdraw. Sometimes they'll just hide in their rooms. They don't want to do school. It's very difficult to have young people on Zoom. I know when I'm doing telehealth with young kids, they're leaving the camera, they're running around their room, they're showing me things. The dog barks and they run downstairs. It's really hard for them. Sometimes they don't want to do school. They don't want to do school online. They just want to go in person. So then we have some problematic behaviors. I know I was talking to some educators where some of the young children during Zooms were turning their videos off and on and, you know, writing some bad things in the chat rooms, stuff like that. You know, again, those are just problematic behaviors. They're stressed out, or they'll have somatic complaints. I don't feel good today, mommy. I don't want to do school. My tummy hurts. They might have some sleep and appetite changes. Stress in adolescence, similar but different. So adolescent complaints, somatic complaints become more descriptive. I have a migraine. I'm having nauseous. I'm having cramps. My muscles hurt. But they're still having some somatic complaints. Adolescents withdrawing and shutting down. I know that many of the adolescents told me at the conclusion of last year's school year that they would log into their Google Meet or their Zoom and then they would just go back to bed. That they just didn't feel like doing anything and they just shut down. They stopped doing their homework because they didn't think it mattered anymore. Certainly irritability and anger, that is a adolescent developmental behavior, but certainly when they are stressed, it becomes worse. Increased emotional responses, that knee-jerk, you know, did you do your homework and the child is screaming, or can you pick up your laundry and they explode. And we're sort of looking at them like, what happened? Well, what happened is they're stressed and it was just that little push that kind of sent them over the edge. Academic performance, you know, some adolescents, their academic performance is declining because maybe they don't understand what's going on, or they don't have enough information, or they're tired of doing Zoom, or, you know, multiple things can be happening. But we need to expect that there may be a decline in academic performance before we're able to catch, you know, all the students up. You know, hopelessness, you know, last year at the end of the school year, children were really feeling very hopeless that any of it would end, because we kept saying remote, and then we were going to open, and then remote, and then we were going to open, and then finally we just closed till the end of the year and did all remote. And they really just, you know, there was problems with technology, and sometimes they were handing in assignments and they weren't getting to teachers, and they just felt like, what does it matter? You know, it doesn't matter, this school year's a wash, we're done, we're just going to wait till next year. And of course now next year comes and they're remote again. So we have to work out some of those things. Adolescents, I already talked about their sleep patterns, with them sleeping all night. You know, some of my teenagers are not eating, some of them are eating too much. Difficulty concentrating. I have a teenager who was an avid reader, and she said, I just realized I don't read anymore. I read the page and I don't remember what I read, and I can't concentrate. You know, and again, a teenager who's stressed out and who already has anxiety, and so things are getting worse for her as she becomes more stressed out. And then I also know that there's a great deal of self-medicating going on, both at the adult level. So is that what we're modeling to our children? And also the adolescent level, where they are saying there is more use of vapes, and that they are using more marijuana than they did when they were actually in school in person, because they can and they're home and it's available. So then we have to look at mental health, you know. So we've talked about trauma, we've talked about stress, and now we have to look at mental health. So we can at least try in our detective hat to figure out what it is. And again, I'm not asking any of you to be diagnosticians or to diagnose children. I'm just asking you to be aware of some of the things that we might see. And so the four main ones that I'm going to go over are depression, PTSD, anxiety, and substance abuse. And again, I'll start with the young kids, and won't spend too much time because I know we have middle school, high school, although some of these may apply to some of your 11 and 10, 12-year-olds that you do have. So this is what depression looks like in younger children. frequent sadness, the hopelessness, they're not interested in anything, they're bored. You know, I'm bored. I hear that a lot. I'm so bored. Social isolation. So whereas some of the teenagers can do some of the, you know, Zoom rooms or Netflix movies or things like that, little kids can't do that without help. They can't do it unless their mom sets it up or their dad sets it up. So their social isolation is much more prevalent than the teenagers. And we see how much it's affecting the teenagers. So then again, think about the younger kids, it's affecting even more. You know, if a child has low self-esteem, and that's a really easy thing to do, you know, when you open up the school year and you're getting to know your new classmates and we're asking them questions, ask them, you know, what are your strengths? What are you good at? If the child can't answer you, that's what I call a red flag. That's something I need to pay attention to. So for a child like that, I need to develop some of those skills. Do they have trouble concentrating? And again, over Zoom is very hard, but we need to be able to assess whether it's just the Zoom platform or the Google Meets platform, or it's that they're really having trouble. Children of this age are going to be very sensitive to rejection or failure. So if you say to them, you're being scatterbrained or you're, you know, daydreaming or you're being silly, you know, they're going to take that as a rejection. They're going to take that as failure. So we need to be very careful about what we say. Somatic complaints. Do they, you know, are they complaining of stomach aches and headaches and nausea and things like that? And then we need to be able to have also, you know, conversations with kids about whether they are thinking about suicide. Despite the COVID and the quarantine, we are still hospitalizing young children who, in the ages of 10, 11, 12, who are having suicidal thoughts and need a higher level of care. So I don't want anybody to think that that has kind of gone away with COVID. Anxiety. So this is what anxiety looks like in younger children. Difficulty concentrating. They have some sleep appetite problems, irritability. They will have outbursts. You know, a lot of my parents are reporting that, you know, when they want to go to the grocery store, their child's having this big outburst about going to the grocery store. It's not about that they're having an outburst. It's just their anxiety about going out in public and being around people is so high that then the emotional dysregulation comes in, and here's the reaction. They're tense or fidgety, constantly worrying, but tense or fidgety. Like when I had kids in my office, for the first several sessions until they really got to know me and we started doing some good work, I could bet you that children would take at least 2 trips to the bathroom. And I do notice that when I'm doing some telehealth that they're still doing that now. They've kind of regressed to that again. Like I have to go to the bathroom and they're gone, and then they come back and I have to go to the bathroom and they're gone. That's just them being anxious and worrying. Crying and clinging, we may not see that, although we may see that when we're trying to get them into class and they don't want to do there. And then again, somatic complaints. And then PTSD in children looks like this. So you see a lot of the symptoms are similar, but they will be very preoccupied with the event. So one of my clients' child was very scared to go outside the house. And when we actually sat down and really got to the bottom of it, she interpreted COVID as being a monster that was outside the house. And if she went outside, the COVID monster was going to get her. And she was even able to draw the COVID monster. This is a child's perception. And so she was really fixated on the COVID monster outside the house. So again, you know, that might look like, you know, that might be anxiety, or that might be, you know, she's really traumatized by the anxiety that her mother had, and the fears that her mother had. Reoccurring dreams or nightmares. And these, you know, sometimes children will tell you about them in their journals. Avoiding reminders, school refusal, argumentative. You know, the ones on the right, we've all talked about, except the questioning beliefs. Like they will sometimes question what is real or what is true, or, you know, what they believe in, because they can't process whatever the event is. So again, for sudden deaths that are happening during COVID, it's really hard for young children to process them because our normal process has been disrupted and we haven't been able to kind of create something different at all in all situations. So then what does depression in adolescent looks like? A lot of the same symptoms. And again, you'll see a lot of these things mirror some of the symptoms we saw in stress. mirror some of the symptoms we saw with the traumatized, youth. And again, it's about having the conversations and getting information. And I'm not asking you to dig deep into their souls or to find out all of their deep, dark secrets, but I am asking you to be open to the consideration that there is more going on than just what we see on the surface. So depression in adolescence looks like, a lack of energy. They do have sad moods. They don't enjoy things. My teen the other day, I'm so bored, rinse and repeat. Definitely very unmotivated, very low energy, hasn't left his room, not getting out of bed. Yeah, these are all things that are indicative of a teenager who is experiencing some depression. Difficulty concentrating and making decisions. You're going to be able to see that when you begin school, whether you're remote or in person. You're going to be able to see that. And I encourage teachers to ask children to make decisions, even if it's simple decisions. Do you want to have your report due on Friday or Wednesday? Do you want to have a review for the test the day before the test or 2 days before the test? Like simple things and then we look to see if they can make a decision. We're going to do a book report. Here's the 4 people you can do it on. Who do you pick? And not accepting the I don't know. When we're giving them the options, the I don't know is not acceptable. When we're talking about feelings, the I don't know is acceptable because they may not know and they may not be able to put that into words. Sleep appetite changes, again, complaints of tiredness, which you're going to see because they're up all night. Withdrawing, that whole thing. I know a lot of the schools right now are requiring the children to be on camera so that they can see them. You're going to be able to see some of these things. Are they paying attention? What's their hygiene like? Like, are they dressed? Do they look like they got a shower? Are they snapping when you call on them? Are they avoiding some of the discussions? What's their academic performance? We'll see things in the writings and drawings. So I tell educators, because you're still doing writing assignments and they're still being made some drawings, look at that. Use of substances. We're not going to be right on top of kids like we are in school, where we can maybe, send a child to the nurse that we suspect might be on something. We can't do that any longer. They're not in person. So if we don't see it blatantly, and then what do? We need to have a plan for if we suspect a child is under the influence, what is the process? Anxiety in adolescence. Again, some of the same things. And like I said, the somatic complaints for teenagers gets very descriptive. So you'll see the list there. But they will be very worried about things. And it'll be unrealistic fears. If we come back to school, I'll get COVID. Now, is that a realistic or an unrealistic fear? Well, for some people, it's very realistic, and for some, it's very unrealistic. Trouble concentrating, remembering things. Again, the indecisiveness. Let's help them make decisions. The part that stands out is really becoming fixated on whatever the fear or worry is and not being able to deviate from that. And you'll see that pervasively in the work they hand in or in their writings. Feeling on the edge. I get that a lot from adolescents. I feel like I'm right on the edge, and again, on the edge of what? So if they say that to you, what's the edge? What does the edge look like? What's on the other side of the edge? What happens if you fall off the edge? Really getting adolescents to think about where they are. They need constant reassurance, so they demand a lot of extra attention, or they become very quiet and withdraw. So we need to watch for those things. And of course, changes in academic performance, which I think we're going to see a decline in academic performance initially when kids return, and then we're going to see it kind of level off. PTSD in adolescence. This one, teenagers will be much more verbal about their symptoms of PTSD. They will be able to talk to you about maybe some of the flashbacks they have or the nightmares, or how that event keeps coming up in their head. Like they might say, I can't stop thinking about XYZ. That's re-experiencing the events. Those are intrusive memories. Sometimes they want to avoid, or they're very vigilant, hyper vigilant. They may have a negative outlook. If one of their friends, for instance, passed away, they might think that, okay, that's going to happen to everybody. And then there's some physical reactions, all of those somatic things we talked about. So substance abuse in adolescents. You know, when they're in school, it's sometimes easier to detect whether a child is under the influence. When they're remote, it's a little bit harder, you know, but these are things that I try to alert parents to when I'm doing parenting workshops is, you know, are they increasingly secretive? You know, what is their academics right now? And again, I'm going to allow some leeway for a decline at the beginning of the school year, but then I'm going to want to see where them functioning at the level they were prior to COVID. You know, are they having difficulty focusing or concentrating or withdrawing, changing friends? Are there some antisocial behaviors going on? I know that because, you know, the students were quarantined and there was a lot of use of marijuana, that as the quarantine got lifted and the police were more prevalent, that children were getting caught in parks smoking marijuana or having paraphernalia on them. And so they've, you know, been taken to the police station and processed, and their parents have had to come and things like that. You know, those are antisocial behaviors, and we may or may not know about that. A lot of times I find that we know that from other peers, like other peers will talk about it. You know, are they becoming more aggressive? And, you know, are they talking about suicide or self-injury? And again, this is one thing I, you know, identified earlier, is that when kids are in school, they do when they're displaying self-injury behavior, they do the thing like wearing sweatshirts when it's warm out, wearing long sleeves when everybody else is wearing short sleeves, wearing pants all the time. When they're at home, they're a little more comfortable in their environment, and we may get the opportunity to see some of those things because they're at home and they don't think we can really see them. And we may be able to see, you know, cuts on their arms or, you know, cuts on their legs if they're wearing shorts, because they're at home and they're in their comfort zone. So they may not think we may be as aware of that. So the road back, what does that look like? We really need to foster safety. Again, safety is emotional, psychological safety. It's really safety for all the students, all the staff, the families, really being able to talk about that and put things in place that the kids feel safe. Fostering equity. There's a lot of social injustice and inequities that we're seeing the climate across the United States with the most recent events, and children are very affected by that. If you have access to any of your kids' Snapchats or blogs, there's a lot of conversation out there about that. Building communities and trustworthiness, you know, building communities. The goal of all the operations and discussions are, you know, should be conducted with complete transparency, with the goal of building and maintaining trust with students, parents, families, staff, so that everybody can collaborate. You know, that leads me into the next one. All the stakeholders have to be on board. Everybody has to have a say. And it's really important because children often feel like they don't have a say and parents don't feel like they have a say. So it's important to bring everybody to the table. Supporting student mental health. What are the resources out there? Who is available? Where can I refer to? You know, screening. A lot of my schools are talking about doing screening so they can assess where students are. You know, a lot of times when we do a screening, we find that there are a lot of students who come up on a screening as needing help that flew under our radar for years. And so a lot of schools are talking about using screening tools in the third week or fourth week of school to assess where the students are functioning. And again, many of those tools are free and very easy to administer. They take 5 or 10 minutes. Empowering. Empowerment is really giving youth a voice, letting them make some decisions, letting them have some choices, you know. And again, we need to give up a little bit more of our control and do things a little bit more collaboratively so that we're all on the same page. Cultural, historical considerations, you know, very important in our current climate that we identify exemplars for some of the racial ethnic groups that we encounter in our schools. It would be great if the race and ethnic culture of the students reflected that of the staff, or vice versa, but that's not always possible. So in lieu of that, we need to be identifying exemplars from the different cultures and ethnic backgrounds as examples for these children. We need to respond to grief. We need to acknowledge that there's been loss. We need to acknowledge that children are sad, that they may be grieving not only the loss of a person, but the loss of a ritual or something that they look forward to. We need to have routines, even remotely. There needs to be a routine for children and teenagers especially. Their routines are really thrown off. We need to foster connection. And so we're going to talk about some strategies to do that. And just because it's off the top of my head and I might forget it later, connecting, doing buddy systems in classes and connecting maybe a youth that you're sure will engage with maybe a youth that doesn't engage so much so that they can connect. Youth to youth connection is a lot stronger sometimes than youth to educator connection. Self-regulation. We need to model and teach and give skills for self-regulation, both ourselves and others. And then we need to have a vision for the future. And this is really important because a lot of our hopelessness and uncertainty and lack of control comes because we've lost our vision for the future. And a vision is really important for us to be able to hold on to something. And we're going to look at each of these separately. So fostering safety is about physical and psychological safety. It's about building relationships. It's about, cultural competence, providing information, creating a culture of joy. And that's not like happy, happy, joy, joy. We all have to be happy all the time, but it's creating a culture that's not so laden full of depressive thoughts and negative thoughts and things like that. Routines, we've talked about that. Acknowledging fears and concerns, and empower self-care. We're going to talk about self-care a little bit more. Building community. And again, building community among all stakeholders, creating belonging, emphasizing, what is our purpose? What are we trying to do? Providing service opportunities. This has been really helpful for some of the teenagers who've actually created some of their own service projects. So I have a group in one of the schools who decided that during COVID, they were going to learn to knit. And they all went on YouTube and they learned to knit, and they're knitting scarves to give to the homeless in the winter. Facilitating cooperative activities, those buddy systems, so that we don't have any students who are going MIA, so that we are connected. Sometimes a mentor system. We assign so many students to one person, and then maybe we have a lunch bunch with them, or maybe we have a night activity with them. And then being aware of what's out there for mental health supports and resources. And again, empowering all the stakeholders, having joint decision-making, multiple modes of learning. This is especially important for remote learning because for our learners who don't do auditory learning as well, it's sometimes hard. So we need to incorporate experiential learning and visual learning. And know what kind of learner you are. So you're able to tell the kids, I'm an experiential learner. I learn by hands-on, so that helps me. Really developing kids' skills and strengths, so that not only are we accentuating their skills and strengths, but we're lifting up the areas where they're weak. We can't lift up the areas that are weak if we don't have a base of strength. So we need to do both of those. Letting them share in the decision-making, simple decisions. Goal setting. When I worked in the hospital and when I worked in schools, we often tried to have meetings in the morning where we set a goal, and it could be a simple goal. I'm going to do 4 out of 10 problems today instead of none that I did yesterday. And we don't ask them at the end of the day if they met their goal. We ask them how they did on their goal. Very different language. And then provide cultural sensitive activities. Great to do, remotely is show and tell. Let them show something from their culture or their ethnicity. Let them show something that they do at home. Let them show something that they've been working on. Responding to grief. We're not going to have any recourse but to respond to grief unless we're going to ignore it, and that is a really negative response. So we need to be able to talk about, what the grief factors are from COVID. Have we lost families and friends? How are we feeling about being, unable to have a viewing, or unable to go to a funeral, or unable to do those things that we normally do, to have those rituals? How do we honor that person that maybe we lost? And dealing with feelings of guilt. Sometimes people feel that when, somebody died of COVID, that they did something wrong. There was a lot in the news about children being carriers for a while. And so I had a lot of children who were thinking that they were going to make their parents get sick, or they were going to make their grandparents get sick. And we had to do some education around that. Check-ins, checking in, checking out. How you doing? What's going on? Here's the vision, and an activity that I encourage teachers to do is a vision board. What does your vision for the future look like? What do you want to do on that? Children can do that at home with poster board and magazines. They can cut out pictures. Young children will draw pictures. So we can do it. And a vision gives us mission and purpose. So creating a vision is something I do with my personal clients, and I also do with groups of providers. So interventions. So 6 to 12, we want to reinforce safety. We want to give concrete examples. We want to listen to them and really listen, not try to fix them or talk over them, but really listen to what they're saying. We want to reassure them that their feelings are okay and validate that whatever feeling they're having, it's all right. We want to be calm so that they can be calm. We want to answer questions. And if we don't know the answers, it's okay to say, I don't know, and maybe I'll try to find it out. And then we want to expect academic difficulties, and we want to normalize that for them so that they don't think that they're the only one having problems. We want to maintain contact with the adults in their lives, the families and the friends. We want to encourage healing tasks, body work, and yoga poses and things like that. We want to be aware of our personal reactions, and we want to allow children to guide the questions. So, yes, we're going to be asking questions, but we also let their questions guide as well, because they need to have that information. And then we're honest with them. We don't make stuff up. So that's a really important thing. Kids can see right through you if you're not being honest. So some specific interventions, for the younger group, I have them make a comic strip about, COVID or what's going on in their life, or, what's happening, in the world. Directing an art project. First aid kits I love. So, and kids are really good at it. So if I say to children, think about somebody or think about maybe having anxiety, or thinking about maybe having ADD, what would you put in a first aid kit for that person? Kids will come up with some wonderful things. So they did some first aid kits for anxiety, and the kids had squeegee balls in it and fidget toys and the packing material that you could pop. Incorporating movement and yoga into your remote sessions. And again, I was on a conference with someone the other day, 3-hour conference, and in the middle of it, the gentleman got up and he was doing body work and showing us some different moves, and he was in this little tiny space, and we all did it too remotely. So the research is showing that we really need to get out and get moving. Show and tell, let the children show and tell something from their house, from their home, something they're proud of. And then SEL, interventions. There's lots of those. Morning meetings, check in, check out. If you go on the CASIL website, which is at the end, the link is there. They have lots of resources for educators to do these kinds of things, to be on top of our kids. Adolescent interventions, being aware of their feelings, being aware of suicide conversations if they're happening. Teenagers talk about suicide. They'll tell me that all the time when I'm on a response to a school where a suicide has occurred. They will tell me that they talk about suicide all the time, but adults won't talk about it. So again, we really need to take a deep breath and allow those conversations to occur. Utilizing self-disclosure. I'm not asking you to tell kids your deep, dark secrets, but certainly you can say, like, I'm concerned about my grandmother, or I'm concerned about my mother, or, I worry about getting the virus, or I worry about, how far behind you guys will be and that I'm not doing enough for you. Like, share with them those things. Those are okay things to share, and they need to know that we're having some of those things too. And discussions on a healthy note. It doesn't have to be a happy, joy note, but a healthy note. So if the discussion is really dark and deep, I try to bring them up a little bit to think about something that will make them feel better. Class specific activities, things for each class that are just theirs. And then affirming to children, they're not crazy. I can't tell you how often I've had people say to me, I think I'm going crazy. And I have to really affirm that, no, you're not going crazy. Everybody's kind of feeling these things. We need to monitor feelings of hate. So in the news, there have been certain ethnic and racial groups that have been blamed for the virus, or blamed for this, or blamed for that. And some of our kids are hearing that and kind of jumping on that bandwagon. And we need to monitor for that. We need to answer questions, be honest, and be calm. Those are all important things. Monitoring extreme emotions, I love this picture, I have no excuse, I just need help, So again, we're not attacking students or thinking that they're just making excuses. We're really trying to help them, offering comfort and support. That is not sympathy, that is empathy. There's a big difference. Substance abuse. We need to talk about that. Kids are talking about it. Personal hygiene. You're going to be able to see that when you're on remote. You know, are your teenagers showering? Do they look like they just crawled out of bed? You know, do they look like they're still sleeping? You know, are they absent from school? I had one principal and a counselor show up to a house because the child did not attend remote for a week, and the parent was stunned. The child never missed another remote session. And I'm not saying that's always a intervention that will work depending on how many kids you have in a school. But again, we need to be creative and think out of the boxes. Monitoring changes, watching for exacerbation of pre-existing conditions. If we know that a child has anxiety, then we need to watch for if it's getting worse. And referring. When we're in over our heads, you know, don't go in over your heads, refer. There are people out there, know those mental health resources. Interventions for teenagers, journaling. I have most of my teenagers journaling either on their phone or actually in a real journal. Blogging, they're creating blogs and they're blogging back and forth. The first aid kits I do with the teenagers just as much as I do with the young children. There are phone apps. I actually encourage teachers to do a phone app project. Find a phone app that helps you to relax and then present it to the class. Include music on your remote sessions when they're working. Create humorous moments. You know, laughter is one of the best medicines. It always has been. And we need to make sure that we are laughing. Incorporate relaxation techniques into your remote learning. If you've gone an hour on remote, have everybody stand up or have them lay down and breathe or have them do a yoga pose. Create a challenge that is healthy. Teenagers are used to challenges. We've had some real negative ones. Create a healthy one. I challenge everybody to go find a new skill and bring it to show and tell. You know, again, take up a new skill or hobby. I tell the teenagers sometimes, go on Pinterest, go on Etsy, see what thing like jumps out at you, and then see if you can try it. And your self-care. This is a really important thing because if we do not take care of ourselves, we cannot take care of our students. And so there are two assessments that I encourage you to explore later. One is the ACE, the Adverse Childhood Experience. So it tells us what our ACE score is. So we know what traumas have affected us in our life, really, really important. And then the ProQual is a assessment that measures if we are experiencing secondary traumatic stress, if we're experiencing burnout, or if we're experiencing compassion fatigue. And I, as a provider and a responder, do the ProQual probably every 6 months, just to gauge where I'm at. Do I need to do more self-care? Am I not doing enough? And as providers and educators, I encourage you to do both of these assessments and know where you are functioning. You know, are you at risk? You know, people always tell me I'm okay, I'm okay, I'm okay, and then their children tell me something completely different. So this is like an honest questionnaire for you. You don't have to give me any of the answers, but do you find yourself more critical, cynical, or sarcastic? You know, do you have trouble having fun or experiencing joy? Is it difficult to get out of bed and open your computer? Are you more irritable and less patient? You know, do you feel insurmountable barriers like you can't do this? A lot of teachers have said to me, I didn't sign up for this. If I wanted to be a remote teacher, I would have joined, you know, online schooling, but I didn't want to do that. So sometimes this does feel really big. You know, do you feel disillusioned about your job? That whole thing of I didn't sign up to be a remote teacher. You know, are you satisfied with some of the achievements or the achievements of your students? Do you have no energy? Are you not productive? Do you have a hard time laughing at yourself? Are you tired of your coworkers asking if you're okay? And that goes with our children. You know, if our children say to us, you know, Mommy, you're always yelling, or Mommy, you're so impatient, we need to pay attention to that. Are we self-medicating with substances? Again, my happy hour lady, you know, every Friday night didn't make her happy. What are our sleep and appetite patterns? And are we having somatic complaints? You know, and here's some helpful suggestions. So I encourage people to have a meeting with themselves every day. And that meeting is just about, hey, what am I going to do today? And what's today going to look like? And instead of staying in bed all day, I'm just going to get out and maybe do one load of laundry. Or I'm going to get out for a walk and I'm going to walk around the block 3 times. But have a meeting with yourself each morning to kind of just give yourself a guide for the day. Not a plan, but a guide. Establish a gratitude practice. The research has actually proven that when we do a gratitude practice, our autonomic nervous system which dictates that anxiety and sometimes make us very stressed and things like that, actually relaxes when we're doing a gratitude practice. And a gratitude practice is not this huge thing of, I'm grateful because I get to go on vacation, or that kind of thing. A gratitude practice can be as simple as, I'm grateful I got out of bed today. I'm grateful that I walk. I'm grateful that I talk. I myself encourage all my clients to do a gratitude practice. I do one twice a day. I do it in the morning when I wake up, and I do it at night when I go to sleep. And the other thing I do at night is to have a recap daily. So I think about one good thing that happened during the day, and it can be very simple. The other night, my recap was, I went for a walk and I got to see 2 big deer and 3 baby deer grazing by the lake. And it was really beautiful. And it was just nice to sit there and watch them. That was a nice thing that happened for my day. You know, if you can meet with coworkers or supervisors, if they're available, if you're a person who doesn't necessarily connect with coworkers or supervisors, seek somebody else out that you do, a friend, you know, a support group. Don't forget the work that you do. It is still very important, even though sometimes as educators we feel that people don't appreciate us. It is still very, very important. And if you need to, seek out a therapist. You know, as a therapist, I always recommend therapy. It was very beneficial for me. I do it as a living, and I recommend it for everybody. And again, don't try to change everything at once. They say it takes 21 days to change, you know, a bad habit. So if we just try to change one thing and work on that for 21 days, that's enough. We don't need to tackle the whole world. So here's some resources. The 2 at the bottom are the CASEAL, which is where some of the SEL activities are for you that you can look up. The one at the top, the Whole Life Child Matters, really gives you a rundown of some mental health signs and symptoms in all age children's, including preschool, which I did not go over. So if you're interested in that, you can look that up. The other, Polaris Teen, gives you resources for teenagers. It's really good. So I would look into that. Again, I am available if you have any questions. If you don't feel like you can ask questions in this general format, you can certainly email me. I will respond to the email and I will answer the questions. So with that, Kadi, I am going to turn it over to you. We have about 15 or 20 minutes for questions.
Hi, PJ. Thank you so much. I have invited all attendees to either enter your questions in the chat box or in the Q&A pod. So I have a question in the meantime while we gather some more questions from the attendees. Sometimes due to remote platforms, the students may feel a little bit disconnected, not only from their teacher, but from other classmates. And I'm sure this might be a typical situation if, let's say, a new student comes into the district or into the school and it's their first day. Do you have any suggestions as to how an educator might make them feel welcome, and also other students in the classroom, even if it's in a remote platform?
So new students, yep, really difficult for new students to start at a new school, especially being remote and not knowing anybody. But I would do some of those strategies, like, you know, when you have a first meet and greet, to elicit some questions from the kids. Tell us about yourself, your favorite movie, a good thing you did this summer, and your favorite actor. And go around the room when the kids are in the classroom. And that way, children begin to identify who may be similar to them, who has similar interests. And then also for learning purposes, I would, just like we buddy children up in school, or new kids with kids who have been in school for a long time, I would buddy them up and say, you know, you're going to be the new student's buddy, so that you can familiarize themselves with how the school works, and, you know, you can work with them until they feel a little bit more comfortable. So I would definitely do some opening sort of icebreakers, and if you need ideas, I have a ton. And I would definitely buddy those new children up with children who've been in the school for a period of time.
Yes, absolutely. I can relate. Sometimes I've heard of new student school ambassadors, or a welcome committee, or it's kind of like a welcome club where they can buddy up with a new student from another district to try to not only make them feel welcome, but also assist them in the transition, and most likely, be a link to all the resources and activities that the school has, but maybe certain things are not even being held remotely. But at least there's someone there that they can talk to or get more information from that isn't a school official or a school staff person.
Yep.
So I have a question here. So it says, what if the brain injury already exists? Does this change the dynamic of trauma?
If the brain injury, I'm not exactly sure what the question is. If the brain injury already exists and the brain has changed, it does affect, an additional trauma will affect that brain, causing maybe some more damage, but also the opposite works. If we can put in some additional components that the student learns, again, the brain is dynamic and their healing can occur. So if, for instance, a child is traumatized and already has trouble with memory, or already has trouble with emotional regulation, and then another event happens which makes that worse, we can still put in those strategies in place to teach emotional regulation and to teach them alternative coping strategies and to teach them some memory techniques so that we can help them to be successful. So I'm not sure if that was answering your question, but that's how I understood it.
Yes. So I will wait to see if the attendee has any other clarifying questions.
Okay.
There's another question that I have. I know you mentioned the adolescents. Sometimes there might be busy all throughout the night doing other things, and then maybe feeling tired in the morning to attend class, whether in person or remote. So do you have any strategies to get, to help them understand the importance of a well-rested night's sleep and how it can impact their academic performance or just their overall functioning?
So a lot of times adolescents are, we need to get them to buy in to what we're talking about. So one of the things that we can do is to sort of do an experiment with adolescents. Let's do an experiment and see what happens. So tonight I want you to stay up till 2 in the morning. And I want you to get up, and in the morning, we're going to see how everybody feels, whether you were hungry this morning or whether you had trouble falling asleep or whether you were able to stay asleep. And then the next night, I might do a different experiment. Okay, how about we all go to bed at 9 o'clock and see what happens tomorrow morning, and let's come back and report and see which one was better. And so we kind of give adolescents the experience so they'll buy in. Oftentimes, our reaction as adults is we tell adolescents what to do, and we don't give them the opportunity to experience and or learn. And when we're talking at them, they sort of tune us out. So it's better if we can engage them through some kind of a, again, challenge, experiment, let's try something new sort of approach, so that, they can see that. Or sometimes they can get to themselves. I can say to them, what happens when you stay up all night? What happens the next day? And they might say, well, I slept till 2 and I missed lunch, and then my eating was off, and then I couldn't get back to sleep. So sometimes we can problem solve with them to get them to come to the realization that sleep is an important thing. I always say, even when schools were in person, that we sort of had it reversed, because we started the teenagers at 7:30. We started the middle school at 8, and then we started the little kids at 8:30. And I always said it should be reversed, because we know that teenagers need more sleep, and little kids don't need much sleep at all. They're the ones that wake up at 5 in the morning and are ready to go and drop off at 8 at night. So sometimes we just need to reverse that learning. But if we can get adolescents to buy in, even, same with like substance abuse. When I talk about marijuana with kids, I say to children, marijuana does change the brain. And I have PET scan pictures that show them that. And then I say, sometimes it affects our memory, it or affects our motivation. And I ask them, have you seen any of your friends who use marijuana, become motivated or not care about things? And they'll be able to identify that in their friends once you give them the information, if you don't push it on them. So it's really about getting teenagers to buy in. And we have to do that using a little bit of psychological, I call it warfare. So.
I see. Thank you. So
Mhm.
there's more clarifying information to the previous question that I asked. What the attendant was referring to was if a baby has a brain injury and it is in an environment that is dysfunctional in some way, can the damage or trauma be reversed with the new environment, or is it lost?
No.
Will this
So
trauma be carried into their school lives?
So it can go either way. So if a child has a brain injury and is in an abusive environment, yes, that will keep changing the brain in a negative way. But because the brain is still developing up until children are 26, there is still room for us to replace that with some healing preventative methods. And if they are taken out of an abusive environment and put in a healthier environment, that can change the brain. The damage cannot necessarily be permanent, although it could be permanent. I'm not a neurologist, and only a neurologist can really identify whether damage is permanent or can be changed. But we do know that the brain is dynamic and it is pliable, and we can put in place some alternative strategies. Because I worked in head injury for 8 years prior to coming into the counseling field, we saw a lot of patients who had severe brain injuries that the prognosis coming out of surgery or coming out of their accident was that they would never do XYZ again. And we found with intensive rehab and really some time and some different strategies that we were able to get them to do things that even the doctors were surprised. So again, I really believe that the brain is still one of the organs that we know a great deal about and know so little about. And so I always err on the side of, if we can provide those strategies and that alternative living situation that is healthier, that we can have children who can be successful.
Yes. So that the same person says thank you, and she found the presentation very interesting. Thank you so much for your
Thank
feedback.
you.
So at this time, if we don't have any other questions in our Q&A pod, can you move the slide, please, to the QR code?
Yep.
Thank you.
Oh. There we go.
So as I mentioned earlier before we launched our webinar, we are a SAMHSA funded program, and our evaluation is closely tied to our funding. So we are required to have an 80% response rate. So if you can either please complete our evaluation survey using the QR code. Also, when you click out of Zoom, and the browser will automatically redirect you to our survey. And then I'll also email a link to the survey to all of our attendees today. Again, I just wanted to thank you all for joining us. I know we had some technical difficulties in our earlier webinar that started at 9:30, and we apologize for that in advance, but we hope that you stay safe and well. And I'll turn it over to PJ for any final words.
Thank you very much for attending. And again, Kadi will put my email in the chat box if you have a question that you didn't want to ask publicly. Certainly, please feel free to email me. I will answer those questions. And thank you for attending, and everyone stay well and healthy. And good luck with the start of the school year.
Good luck, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.